At the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union was a giant teetering on the edge. For decades, it had been a superpower, a nation stretching across 11 time zones, a military and ideological rival to the United States. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Economically, politically, and socially, the USSR was exhausted. Centralized planning had brought industrial achievements, yes, but it had also created inefficiency, stagnation, and corruption. Everyday life was a struggle. Lines for basic groceries, shortages of consumer goods, and declining living standards were becoming normal. People talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union as a political event, but it was first and foremost a human story. Ordinary citizens, factory workers, teachers, farmers, and office clerks felt the instability in their daily lives. Pensions that were once promised vanished, salaries became unreliable, and inflation soared. The security that decades of Soviet ideology had promised now seemed fragile. Families who had grown up believing in the permanence of the Soviet system were suddenly confronted with uncertainty. Politically, the situation was chaotic. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, had tried to reform the system with policies like perestroika and glasnost, economic restructuring and openness. The aim was to modernize the economy and make governance more transparent, but the reforms had unexpected consequences. By opening up the system, Gorbachev allowed people to speak freely, criticize leadership, and explore alternatives. This freedom revealed deep divisions. Republics demanded more autonomy, nationalist movements surged, and the central government's authority eroded. By 1991, the Soviet Union was fracturing. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania pushed for independence. Ukraine, Belarus, and Central Asian republics also began to assert their sovereignty. For Russia, the largest successor state, this was a moment of both crisis and opportunity. The collapse left Russia as the inheritor of a complex legacy, the world's largest nuclear arsenal, a sprawling military, vast natural resources, and a population with deep social and economic challenges. But with that inheritance came immense responsibility and an equally immense vulnerability. Economically, the situation was dire. The centralized Soviet economy had been unable to compete with the market-driven systems of the West. Factories shut down, agriculture declined, and consumer goods were scarce. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, leaving ordinary Russians struggling to survive. The transition to a market economy, championed by reformers like Igor Gaidar, created winners and losers. Privatization allowed a small number of individuals to acquire massive wealth almost overnight, while millions of ordinary citizens found themselves unemployed or impoverished. In the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and smaller cities, frustration, confusion, and fear were palpable. At the same time, the world was changing rapidly around Russia. The United States emerged as the unchallenged global power, promoting democracy, free markets, and liberal values. NATO, once seen as a Cold War military alliance, began to expand eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact countries. For many Russians, this expansion was perceived as a direct threat, a humiliation after decades of superpower status. It wasn't just a political or military concern, it was existential. Russia had once been a global player, and now it felt sidelined. The sense of lost prestige fueled a deep national anxiety, one that would shape domestic politics for decades to come. In cities across Russia, the human impact of these geopolitical shifts was evident. Young people wondered about their future. Would there be jobs, opportunities, or stability? Parents worried about healthcare, education, and basic necessities. People traveled abroad for the first time in decades, only to encounter a world that had moved on without them. The Cold War was over, but the consequences of its end were still unfolding, not just for governments and armies, but for everyday lives. This period of instability also created opportunities for new political actors. Boris Yeltsin, who had risen to prominence as a reformist in Moscow, captured the public's imagination. He represented a break from the old Soviet elite, a promise of freedom, democracy, and modernization. But his presidency would be controversial. The reforms he enacted were often painful, unpopular, and chaotic. Russia teetered between progress and collapse, with economic shocks, political unrest, and growing inequality defining the 1990s. Even as the country struggled domestically, Russia's geopolitical environment became increasingly complex. The newly independent republics in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were not just neighbors, they were former Soviet territories with their own ambitions. Russia needed to navigate relationships with these countries carefully, balancing influence with diplomacy, and sometimes resorting to coercion or economic pressure. The seeds of future conflicts, whether in Chechnya, Georgia, or Ukraine, were being planted during this tumultuous decade. The human cost of this period cannot be overstated. Life expectancy in Russia dropped, crime rose, and social services crumbled. Ordinary citizens faced a daily struggle to adapt to a world that no longer promised certainty. At the same time, Russian culture, literature, film, and media reflected this tension. Artists, writers, and filmmakers grappled with the collapse of old ideologies, exploring themes of identity, loss, and survival. The psychological impact of the Soviet collapse continues to resonate today, influencing how Russians perceive their place in the world. Yet, amid this chaos, there was also resilience. Communities adapted, entrepreneurs emerged, and new ideas took root. Russians learned to navigate the new market economy, to cope with uncertainty, and to assert themselves in a rapidly changing global environment. This period was a crucible, forging a generation that would inherit both the potential and the challenges of a redefined Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union also created a stark contrast between perception and reality. Internationally, Russia was often portrayed as weak, chaotic, or irrelevant. But internally, many Russians viewed the collapse as a temporary setback, a period that could be overcome by strong leadership, national unity, and a clear vision for the future. This mindset would set the stage for the rise of Vladimir Putin, the reassertion of Russian power, and the complex geopolitics that define the region today. In summary, the fall of the Soviet Union was not just a political event, it was a human experience. It reshaped lives, economies, and identities. Ordinary people felt the consequences in their homes, workplaces, and communities. Russia emerged as a country with vast potential, but also immense challenges. The stage was set for a new era, one where questions of national pride, security, and influence would dominate both domestic and international politics. The world had changed, and Russia was forced to adapt, survive, and eventually reclaim its place on the global stage. The collapse was chaotic, painful, and uncertain, but it was also the beginning of a story that continues to unfold. A story of resilience, ambition, and the search for identity in a world that had moved on. From the streets of Moscow to the halls of power, from ordinary citizens to emerging leaders, the shadow of the Soviet collapse continues to shape Russia's present and its path toward a new empire. After the turbulent 1990s, Russia was a nation in search of stability. The economy had suffered, political authority had weakened, and ordinary citizens were exhausted by years of uncertainty. It was in this climate of disillusionment that Vladimir Putin emerged. Putin's story is emblematic of post-Soviet Russia itself. Born in 1952 in Leningrad, he rose through the ranks of the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence service. Trained in secrecy, discipline, and strategy, Putin learned the art of observation, control, and influence, skills that would define his leadership style decades later. After the Soviet collapse, he transitioned into politics, serving in regional administration and later in Moscow's city government. His reputation as a competent, decisive, and discreet administrator caught the attention of Russia's top political figures, including then-President Boris Yeltsin. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, and Vladimir Putin became acting president. The country was exhausted by chaos and corruption, and many Russians were eager for a leader who could restore order. Putin positioned himself as that figure, a man of strength, pragmatism, and national pride. he promised stability, economic recovery, and a return to global relevance. For millions, he represented hope, a chance for Russia to reclaim a sense of dignity and purpose. Putin's early presidency focused heavily on consolidating power. Politically, he curtailed the influence of oligarchs, wealthy businessmen who had gained enormous control during the privatization of the 1990s. He reasserted federal authority over Russia's regions, limiting separatist movements and ensuring that governors and local leaders aligned with the central government. National unity became a central theme, and the Kremlin emphasized the importance of a strong state as a guarantor of stability. Economic policy under Putin was pragmatic. Russia's economy benefited from a surge in oil and gas prices during the early 2000s, providing resources for modernization, investment, and social programs. Ordinary Russians felt tangible improvements. Wages rose, pensions were partially restored, and the middle class began to grow. Putin used these economic gains to strengthen legitimacy and reinforce his image as a capable manager of the state. Internationally, Putin sought to restore Russia's influence. While the country no longer held superpower status equivalent to the Soviet Union, it remained a nuclear power with vast natural resources and strategic geopolitical weight. Putin emphasized a foreign policy rooted in national interest, security, and prestige. The world watched as Russia reasserted itself in former Soviet territories, from Chechnya to the Caucasus, demonstrating a willingness to defend its sphere of influence. The Chechen Wars were pivotal. The conflict in Chechnya in the late 1990s had been brutal, with insurgents resisting Moscow's control. Putin's decisive and often harsh response projected strength, reinforced central authority, and sent a clear message: Russia would defend its territorial integrity at any cost. At home, this earned him approval, particularly among voters tired of lawlessness and fragmentation. Media and propaganda played a central role in consolidating authority. Independent media outlets that criticized the government were gradually brought under state influence. Television, the dominant source of information for most Russians, became a tool for shaping narratives, emphasizing stability, patriotism, and the leadership's achievements. At the same time, Putin cultivated an image of toughness. Judo photos, horseback rides, and direct public appearances reinforced his persona as a hands-on, resilient leader. By 2004, Putin had secured a second presidential term, solidifying the foundations of new political order. His leadership style blended pragmatism, authoritarianism, and nationalism. The initial focus was on domestic consolidation, stability, economic recovery, and central authority, but the underlying goal was also clear. Russia would no longer tolerate weakness or marginalization on the world stage. However, authoritarian consolidation came with costs. Political opposition was marginalized, civil society curtailed, and dissenting voices faced intimidation, legal challenges, or exile. The balance between freedom and order tilted decisively towards control. For many Russians, this was acceptable, a price worth paying for stability. But for observers abroad, it marked the erosion of democratic principles that had emerged in the 1990s. Part A concludes with a clear picture. Vladimir Putin had transformed from a relatively unknown bureaucrat into a decisive national leader. He restored a sense of purpose, pride, and stability to Russia, while centralizing power and reshaping political institutions to ensure long-term control. The stage was set for the next chapter, the extension of Russian influence beyond its borders, and the emergence of a confident, assertive foreign policy. Ukraine has long been at the center of Russia's strategic thinking. Its geographic location, cultural ties, and economic significance make it a country that has both symbolized opportunity and provoked anxiety for Moscow. Understanding the Ukraine factor is essential to understanding Russia's broader ambitions under Vladimir Putin. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine declared independence in 1991. It was a young country with vast potential but facing immense challenges. Economically, it had inherited Soviet-era industries that were inefficient and outdated. Politically, it was experimenting with democracy, navigating a difficult transition from centralized Soviet authority to independent governance. and socially the country was divided. Western Ukraine leaned toward European integration and reform, while eastern regions, with strong industrial bases and Russian-speaking populations, maintained closer ties to Russia. In 2004, Ukraine became the center of international attention with the Orange Revolution. The presidential election that year exposed deep political divisions. Viktor Yanukovych, seen as the pro-Russian candidate, was initially declared the winner amid widespread allegations of fraud and vote manipulation. Massive protests erupted in Kyiv and other cities, mobilizing citizens demanding fair elections and democratic integrity. The streets of the capital were filled with people waving orange flags, chanting for transparency, and calling for change. The Orange Revolution was both a domestic awakening and an international event. It demonstrated that ordinary citizens could influence political outcomes, and that democratic ideals had resonance in post-Soviet states. Eventually, a rerun of the election declared Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate, as the winner. While Yushchenko's presidency faced significant challenges, the Orange Revolution signaled a broader geopolitical shift. Ukraine was asserting its right to determine its own future, independent of Russian pressure. For Vladimir Putin and Moscow, the Orange Revolution was alarming. The success of a pro-Western movement in Kyiv represented a direct challenge to Russia's influence in its near abroad. It demonstrated that popular mobilization, Western support, and international attention could alter the trajectory of post-Soviet states. For Putin, this was more than a regional political event. It was a warning that Russia could no longer assume unquestioned dominance over its neighbors. Following the Orange Revolution, Moscow adjusted its approach. The Kremlin invested heavily in cultivating relationships with pro-Russian politicians, business elites, and media networks across Ukraine. Energy policy became a tool of influence. Russia controlled a significant portion of Ukraine's natural gas supplies, and pipelines running through Ukrainian territory were crucial for European energy markets. Moscow leveraged these dependencies to exert political pressure, influence elections, and assert leverage over Kyiv. The period between 2005 and 2013 was marked by oscillation in Ukraine's political alignment. Some governments leaned toward Europe and Western institutions, pursuing reforms and integration. Others leaned toward Moscow, seeking economic support and political cooperation. Russia used a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and covert influence to maintain its strategic position. These years revealed the fragile balance Ukraine had to navigate, the allure of European integration versus the pressure of historical, cultural, and economic ties to Russia. The situation reached a critical point in 2013. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, elected in 2010 with strong backing from Russia, faced a pivotal decision whether to sign an association agreement with the European Union. This agreement would strengthen economic, political, and institutional ties with Europe, moving Ukraine closer to Western institutions. Moscow viewed this as a direct threat to its strategic interests. The ouster of a pro-Russian leader, the rise of a pro-Western government, and the apparent encroachment of NATO and EU influence near its borders were intolerable from Moscow's perspective. Within weeks, Russia moved decisively to assert control of the situation. The annexation of Crimea in March 2014 was a watershed moment. Russian forces, often described as little green men because of their unmarked uniforms, occupied key military and government installations. Crimea's strategic importance is clear. It hosts the Russian Black Sea Fleet, controls access to the Black Sea, and has historical significance in Russian national identity. A hastily organized controversial referendum was held, and Russia formally annexed the peninsula, claiming to protect Russian-speaking populations and historical ties. International reaction was swift and unified in condemnation. The United States, European Union, and other global actors imposed sanctions, isolating Russia economically and diplomatically. Yet domestically, Putin's actions were widely popular. In Russia, Crimea became a symbol of national pride, the restoration of historical territory, and the protection of ethnic Russians. For Moscow, the annexation was both a strategic and symbolic victory. However, the crisis did not end with Crimea. Eastern Ukraine, particularly the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, became hotbeds of separatist activity. Russia supported separatist movements with political backing, resources, and covert military assistance. The resulting conflict, which escalated into a full-scale war in the Donbas region, demonstrated Moscow's willingness to engage in hybrid warfare, a combination of conventional military support, covert operations, information warfare, and political manipulation. Hybrid warfare became a defining feature of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Cyber attacks targeted Ukrainian infrastructure, disinformation campaigns influenced public opinion, and media narratives were used to justify Russian actions. The strategy blurred the lines between war and peace, making it difficult for the international community to respond effectively. At the same time, it allowed Russia to achieve strategic goals without engaging in open confrontation with Western powers. The conflict also exposed broader vulnerabilities in Ukraine's political and military systems. Years of corruption, underinvestment, and weak institutions made it challenging to mount a unified response. NATO and European support helped, but Ukraine remained heavily reliant on external assistance for security and stability. For Moscow, this imbalance presented both an opportunity and a justification for intervention, positioning itself as the protector of Russian-speaking populations and a guarantor of stability in the face of Western encroachment. The war in Ukraine also had profound global implications. Energy markets, international security arrangements, and regional alliances were all affected. Europe became more attentive to Russia's ambitions, increasing military spending and reinforcing NATO presence in Eastern Europe. Globally, the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbas signaled that post-Soviet borders were contestable, challenging norms established since 1991. Ukraine's journey also reflects the broader struggle between democratic aspirations and authoritarian influence. Western institutions and values clashed with Moscow's vision of regional dominance and state control. The Ukrainian people became the front line of this struggle, experiencing the human cost of geopolitical conflict, displacement, economic hardship, and daily insecurity. Yet their resilience, protests, and continued engagement with democratic ideals showed the enduring power of civil society in shaping national destiny. By the time 2015 arrived, it was clear that the Ukraine factor would define Russian foreign policy for years to come. Crimea remained under Russian control, Donbas remained contested, and Kyiv's ambitions for integration with Europe were complicated by ongoing conflict and instability. The Ukraine crisis also revealed Russia's broader strategic approach: assertive, opportunistic, and willing to challenge international norms when national interests were at stake. The lessons for Putin were clear. First, Russia could assert its influence effectively when it acted decisively and quickly. Second, hybrid tactics allowed Moscow to project power while minimizing direct confrontation with NATO powers. Third, nationalist narratives and historical justifications could galvanize domestic support for controversial actions. And fourth, the West's response, while firm in sanctions, lacked the willingness to engage militarily, creating space for continued Russian assertiveness. The Ukraine factor also reshaped Europe's security landscape. NATO countries increased defense budgets, modernized forces, and strengthened alliances in response to the perceived Russian threat. The European Union faced the challenge of balancing sanctions and diplomacy, while Eastern European states sought assurances against potential aggression. Ukraine became a focal point for the broader contest between Russia and the West, symbolizing the enduring tension between authoritarian resurgence and democratic aspirations. Finally, the Ukraine conflict underscored a fundamental truth. For Russia, the stakes are both strategic and symbolic. Ukraine represents access to resources, control over critical infrastructure, and a buffer zone against perceived threats. It also embodies historical identity, national pride, and the narrative of Russia's restoration after the humiliation of the Soviet collapse. For Moscow, influence over Ukraine is not negotiable. It is central to national security, global positioning, and the projection of power. As we conclude this chapter, it becomes clear that the Ukraine factor is more than a regional issue. It is a lens through which we can understand Russia's ambitions, strategies, and the interplay between domestic politics and foreign policy. From the Orange Revolution to Crimea, Ukraine has been both a stage and a catalyst for Russia's transformation under Vladimir Putin. The events in Kyiv, Donbas, and Crimea illustrate the complexities of post-Soviet geopolitics, a struggle between sovereignty, influence, and the enduring legacy of history. By the time 2021 drew to a close, tensions between Russia and Ukraine had reached unprecedented levels. Moscow's ambitions in Ukraine, shaped by decades of historical ties, geopolitical strategy, and nationalist ideology, had moved from influence to direct intervention. The world watched as Russia amassed troops, military hardware, and logistical networks along Ukraine's borders, signaling the possibility of an all-out invasion. For Vladimir Putin, the stakes were enormous. Ukraine represented a strategic buffer zone between Russia and NATO, a testing ground for new military tactics, and a symbol of Russian resurgence. Years of failed negotiations, diplomatic pressure, and Western support for Kyiv convinced Moscow that decisive action was necessary. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was the result of years of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and strategic calculations. The military buildup in 2021 and early 2022 was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were stationed along the Ukrainian border, with armored divisions, artillery, and air support strategically deployed. Satellite images and intelligence reports revealed the positioning of tanks, missile systems, and long-range artillery capable of striking deep within Ukraine. Logistics and supply chains were meticulously organized, including fuel depots, field hospitals, and communications infrastructure. Every detail reflected Moscow's ambition to execute a rapid and overwhelming campaign. Cyber warfare became an integral part of Russia's strategy. Prior to the invasion, Ukrainian government networks, banking systems, and media outlets experienced unprecedented cyber attacks. Websites were defaced, communications disrupted, and critical data stolen. This digital offensive was designed to sow confusion, disrupt command structures, and weaken Ukraine's ability to respond. At the same time, information operations sought to influence domestic and international perceptions, framing Russia's actions as defensive, justified, or inevitable. The early military strategy followed a classic Russian doctrine: achieve quick, decisive victory. The goal was to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses with speed, precision, and concentrated firepower, capturing key cities, infrastructure, and government institutions before international actors could effectively intervene. Moscow calculated that by striking hard and fast, it could demoralize Ukrainian forces, limit resistance, and project an image of inevitable success. Despite these preparations, the invasion posed immense logistical and operational challenges. Ukraine is a large country with varied terrain, plains, forests, rivers, and urban centers that complicate maneuver warfare. Russian planners had to account for not only conventional resistance, but also asymmetric tactics, guerrilla operations, and the resilience of a population motivated by nationalism and survival. The stakes were not purely military, they were political, social, and symbolic. Diplomacy ran in parallel with military movements. Russia issued demands to NATO and Western powers, warning against support for Ukraine, and framing the conflict as a response to security threats. Moscow insisted on guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO and sought to limit the West's influence in its immediate neighborhood. These negotiations were as much about signaling as about actual compromise, an attempt to control the narrative while preparing the battlefield. By February 2022, the invasion was set in motion. Russian forces crossed into Ukraine from multiple directions, from the north through Belarus toward Kyiv, from the east through the Donbas region, and from the south via Crimea. The initial stages were marked by massive armored columns, rapid airborne operations, and targeted missile strikes. Key infrastructure, airports, bridges, military bases were targeted to cripple Ukraine's ability to mobilize and communicate. The Ukrainian response was unexpected in its resilience. While Moscow anticipated quick capitulation, Ukrainian forces demonstrated tactical flexibility, knowledge of terrain, and a willingness to mobilize civilians for support. Cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv became fortified centers of resistance. Urban warfare, ambushes, and anti-tank operations slowed Russian advances, challenging the assumption that military superiority alone would dictate outcomes. The initial phase of the invasion also revealed the importance of morale and perception. Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike drew on national identity, historical memory, and international support to sustain resistance. Social media played a role, broadcasting images of defiance, rallying global sympathy, and even coordinating logistics and volunteer efforts. Information became a battlefield as vital as tanks, artillery, or missiles. As the invasion progressed, Russia's initial plan encountered difficulties.
logistics proved challenging. Long supply lines were vulnerable to sabotage, fuel shortages, and attacks on convoys. The size and scale of operations created bottlenecks, exposing weaknesses in coordination. Ukrainian forces exploited these vulnerabilities, disrupting communications and supply chains, slowing Russian advances, and forcing Moscow to adapt its strategy. Urban combat became central to the conflict. Cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kyiv were transformed into battlefields. Russian forces attempted to encircle urban centers, cut off supplies, and impose siege conditions. The cost to civilians was catastrophic. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas became sites of bombardment. Millions were displaced internally, while millions more sought refuge in neighboring countries, creating one of the largest refugee crises in Europe since World War II. Russia adapted by emphasizing firepower and attrition. Missile strikes, artillery barrages, and aerial campaigns targeted both military and infrastructure objectives. The goal shifted from rapid victory to sustained pressure, attempting to wear down Ukrainian resistance and force concessions. Hybrid tactics continued to play a role. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and proxy support for separatist regions maintained strategic leverage beyond the front lines. The global response intensified. The United States, European Union, and other allies imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, targeting key industries, financial systems, and individual elites. Military assistance flowed into Ukraine: anti-tank weapons, drones, intelligence support, and training. This external support altered the battlefield dynamics, strengthening Ukrainian resilience and complicating Moscow's calculations. Energy and economic pressures became strategic tools. Europe, heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas, faced a delicate balancing act. Sanctions sought to weaken Russia's ability to fund the war while maintaining energy security. Global food markets, reliant on Ukrainian and Russian exports, experienced disruptions. Wheat, corn, and fertilizer supplies were affected, highlighting the interconnectivity of modern conflict and the broader economic consequences of regional warfare. In response, Russia recalibrated its objectives. The focus shifted from seizing all of Ukraine to consolidating gains in strategic areas, particularly in the Donbass and southern regions. Efforts were made to create land corridors, secure ports, and establish territorial control that would maximize leverage in future negotiations. This strategic patience reflected a broader understanding. Military victory is not only about capturing territory, but shaping political outcomes, bargaining positions, and the perception of power. Information warfare became increasingly central. Russian and Ukrainian narratives competed on multiple fronts: international media, social platforms, and domestic channels. Propaganda sought to justify actions, influence opinion, and maintain morale. Ukraine leveraged global media attention to secure support, frame the conflict as a defense of sovereignty, and highlight civilian suffering. The battle for narrative control became intertwined with the physical conflict on the ground. The war also underscored the evolving nature of modern military strategy. Precision strikes, long-range missiles, drones, cyber operations, and electronic warfare played a dominant role, supplementing conventional armored and infantry tactics. The conflict became a laboratory for testing new technologies, including loitering munitions, hypersonic weapons, and AI-assisted targeting systems. The lessons learned would resonate far beyond Ukraine, influencing military doctrines worldwide. Despite military challenges, Moscow maintained political support domestically. Nationalist rhetoric, historical narratives, and controlled media coverage bolstered the perception that the intervention was justified. The Kremlin framed the conflict as a defense of Russian speakers, protection of borders, and resistance to Western encroachment. Public opinion, shaped by state-controlled narratives, created a buffer against domestic dissent, even as casualties mounted. The invasion also catalyzed international realignment. NATO reinforced eastern flanks, Finland and Sweden moved toward membership, and European defense spending surged. Global alliances shifted, with countries recalibrating their policies in response to Russian aggression. The Ukraine war demonstrated that regional conflicts in the modern era are not contained. They have ripple effects across economies, security alliances, and international norms. Humanitarian consequences were profound. Millions of civilians faced displacement, loss of livelihoods, and exposure to violence. Humanitarian corridors, refugee support, and international aid became critical. The war revealed both the vulnerability of civilians in modern conflicts and the resilience of communities in the face of adversity. It also raised questions about international responsibility, intervention, and enforcement of international law. By mid-2022, it was evident that the Ukraine conflict would be prolonged. Moscow's military strategy had shifted from rapid conquest to attritional warfare, consolidating territory and leveraging asymmetric tactics. Kyiv's defense relied on adaptability, international support, and civilian mobilization. Both sides demonstrated that modern warfare is complex, multidimensional, and deeply intertwined with political, economic, and informational considerations. The Ukraine invasion also highlighted the broader trajectory of Russia's ambitions. Military force, hybrid tactics, strategic patience, and domestic narrative management are central to Moscow's approach. The war underscores the intersection of historical grievances, geopolitical strategy, and contemporary military innovation. For analysts and citizens alike, Ukraine is not only a battlefield, but a case study in the modern exercise of power. In conclusion, Russia's military strategy in Ukraine reflects a careful blend of planning, improvisation, and adaptation. From the early build-up to urban combat, cyber warfare, and international engagement, Moscow's approach demonstrates the complexity of modern conflicts. The invasion is not just about territory, it is about signaling strength, shaping international perceptions, and asserting a vision of Russia's role in the world. The lessons of Ukraine will resonate for decades. The importance of hybrid warfare, the power of international alliances, the resilience of nations under duress, and the enduring interplay between military force and political objectives. For ordinary people, the war is a stark reminder that global conflicts touch lives in tangible ways, from displaced families and disrupted economies to the subtle influence of geopolitics in daily life. Russia's military strategy is ongoing, adaptive, and consequential. Its invasion of Ukraine is a defining moment in 21st century geopolitics, revealing both the power and limits of conventional and unconventional military approaches. Understanding these dynamics is essential to grasping the broader story of Russia's new empire, its ambitions, and the challenges facing the modern world.
With domestic power secured, Putin turned his attention outward. The idea of Russia as a nation humbled and sidelined by the collapse of the Soviet Union was no longer acceptable. Putin's foreign policy emphasized strategic independence, military modernization, and the reassertion of influence in the post-Soviet space. One of the first major tests came in Georgia in 2008. The short but intense conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia demonstrated Russia's willingness to use military force to protect its interests in its near abroad. While the West condemned the actions, Russia projected power and sent a message to neighboring states. Sovereignty might be recognized, but influence would not be easily challenged. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define Russian foreign policy in the coming decade. Economically, Putin pursued policies designed to strengthen state control while encouraging growth. Key sectors, energy, defense, and strategic industries remained under state influence. Companies like Gazprom and Rosneft were used as instruments of both economic policy and geopolitical leverage. Energy became a tool for diplomacy, as Europe's dependence on Russian gas provided Moscow with influence beyond its borders. Strategic investments in partnerships in oil, gas, and pipelines demonstrated how economic policy and foreign policy could intersect. Nationalism became central to Putin's narrative. He emphasized the importance of Russian identity, historical legacy, and national pride. From the annexation of Crimea to the promotion of cultural and religious values, this narrative resonated domestically. It framed Russia as a nation rebounding from humiliation, reclaiming its rightful place in global affairs and defending its people and heritage. Crimea in particular marked a turning point. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine shocked the world. The move was framed domestically as a defensive act, protecting Russian-speaking populations and securing historical territory. Internationally, it drew sanctions and condemnation, but it also signaled that Russia, under Putin, would assert its interests forcefully. Crimea became symbolic, a demonstration that the post-Soviet order was not fixed and that Russia was ready to challenge Western influence when it conflicted with national priorities. In tandem with military interventions, Putin's government modernized Russia's armed forces. Investments in advanced weaponry, cyber capabilities, and strategic deterrence reflected lessons learned from previous conflicts and the importance of projecting strength. Military modernization was not only about defense, it was also about signaling to the world that Russia remained a power capable of influencing global events. Internally, this consolidation of authority and projection of nationalism reinforced Putin's legitimacy. Elections, while nominally democratic, were tightly controlled. Opposition leaders faced legal obstacles, exile, or imprisonment. Media narratives emphasized Russia's resurgence, portraying the nation as a player that could no longer be ignored. At the same time, domestic policies were framed as protecting ordinary citizens from the chaos and instability that had defined the 1990s. The rise of Vladimir Putin also intersected with technology and information. Cyber operations, state-controlled media, and strategic messaging became central tools for shaping both domestic and international opinion. Russia's approach combined traditional political authority with modern tools of influence, a sophisticated blend that allowed it to project power without relying solely on conventional military might. By the late 2010s, the consolidation of power was clear. Putin had transformed Russia into a highly centralized, authoritarian state with the means to pursue ambitious foreign policies. The combination of nationalism, military modernization, economic strategy, and information influence created a system capable of responding to both internal and external challenges. For ordinary Russians, the consequences were mixed. Many experienced improved living standards compared to the 1990s, a sense of national pride and relative stability. Others faced limitations on political freedom, suppression of dissent, and the consequences of aggressive foreign policies. The tension between prosperity, pride, and authoritarian control became a defining feature of modern Russia. In conclusion, Part B shows that the rise of Vladimir Putin was not simply a story of political survival. It was the creation of a new Russian order. Domestic consolidation, economic strategy, nationalism, and assertive foreign policy set the stage for the next phase. Russia's expansionist ambitions, its engagement in global conflicts, and ultimately the challenge in Ukraine. The rise of Putin reshaped Russia internally, restored its confidence externally, and created a foundation for both domestic authority and global influence. The Ukraine invasion was not only a regional crisis, it became a global geopolitical earthquake. The ripples of Russia's actions extended far beyond Europe, reshaping alliances, testing commitments, and redefining international power dynamics. Understanding this chapter of Russia's new empire requires a deep dive into how global powers respond, how alliances evolve, and how the war transformed the international chessboard. From the onset, NATO found itself in a pivotal role. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which had long acted as a stabilizing force in Europe, now faced its most serious challenge since the Cold War. Countries in Eastern Europe, historically wary of Russian aggression, called for strengthened security measures. Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania demanded increased military presence, intelligence sharing, and rapid deployment forces. NATO responded by reinforcing eastern flanks, conducting exercises and increasing funding, demonstrating both unity and deterrence. The United States emerged as the central architect of the international response. Washington's approach combined sanctions, military assistance, and diplomatic coordination. American policymakers leveraged the dollar, international finance systems, and trade mechanisms to isolate Russia economically while simultaneously arming and advising Ukrainian forces. This was a demonstration of soft and hard power in tandem, a multifaceted approach to shaping outcomes without direct military intervention. Yet NATO and U.S. leadership faced challenges. Members differed in willingness to escalate tensions. Germany, for instance, initially hesitated on heavy arms deliveries, weighing energy dependencies and domestic opinion. France emphasized diplomacy while preparing for contingencies. Smaller members, including the Baltic and Nordic nations, pushed for decisive action. Managing these divergent interests required coordination, communication, and a careful balancing act, highlighting that alliances are not monolithic, but negotiated structures constantly in flux. Russia, in turn, sought to consolidate its own alliances and partnerships. Traditional partners like Belarus and the Central Asian states provided logistical and political support. Moscow also cultivated informal alliances with countries outside Europe, signaling opposition to Western-led sanctions and projecting influence globally. These relationships, often economic, political, or military in nature, allowed Russia to mitigate isolation while reinforcing the narrative of a multipolar world resisting Western dominance. China's role became increasingly visible. While Beijing refrained from direct military involvement, it provided a complex mix of diplomatic cover, economic partnership, and cautious support. China emphasized non-interference, called for negotiations, and maintained its energy and trade relations with Russia. At the same time, it subtly challenged Western influence by highlighting perceived hypocrisy and advocating for multipolarity. Beijing's stance reflected a careful calculation to benefit from Russia's confrontation with the West while avoiding sanctions and maintaining its global ambitions. Beyond superpowers, regional alliances were tested. The European Union, historically focused on economic integration, became a security actor almost overnight. UN nations coordinated sanctions, energy diversification, and refugee support, demonstrating that alliances can evolve rapidly in response to crises. Meanwhile, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America observed, weighing economic benefits from Russia and China against the geopolitical risks of siding with the West. These calculations revealed a new reality. In a globalized world, neutrality, or strategic non-alignment, can be a deliberate and influential choice. The conflict also prompted countries to reassess military doctrine. Japan and South Korea reviewed regional deterrent strategies. India reconsidered its stance on balancing relations between Russia and the U.S., and Australia expanded defense cooperation with allies. Globally, nations recognize that local conflicts have international consequences, reinforcing the idea that geopolitics is no longer about distant borders, but interconnected realities. Economic power became one of the most critical instruments in shaping the war's outcome. Sanctions imposed by the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Japan, and other allies aimed to cripple Russia's ability to fund the invasion. Restrictions targeted financial institutions, energy exports, technology transfers, and access to international markets. The strategy was clear: weaken Russia without committing Western troops, applying pressure that could alter Moscow's calculus. The impact was immediate and multifaceted. The Russian ruble initially plummeted, stock markets faced turbulence, and foreign investors withdrew from Russian enterprises. Companies across Europe and Asia were forced to sever ties or adjust operations. Energy markets, heavily reliant on Russian oil and gas, experienced volatility. Countries scrambled to diversify suppliers, secure alternative energy sources, and mitigate inflationary pressures. The global economy became a strategic battlefield, illustrating that economic influence can rival military might in shaping outcomes. Yet sanctions also revealed limitations. Russia adapted by pivoting trade toward Asia, increasing domestic production, and exploiting global demand for commodities. Oil exports to non-Western countries surged. Wheat and fertilizer remained key global supplies, and alternative financial channels were explored. The sanctions war became a complex game of adaptation, signaling that economic pressure is most effective when paired with strategic foresight and international cooperation. Global supply chains, disrupted by sanctions and conflict, underscored the interconnectedness of modern economies. The conflict affected food security in Africa and the Middle East, energy prices in Europe and Asia, and technology markets worldwide. Even companies far removed from Ukraine or Russia felt the impact, demonstrating that localized conflicts now have global economic consequences. Military aid to Ukraine emerged as a second pillar of influence. Weapons, intelligence, and training were provided not only by the United States, but by a coalition of NATO and non-NATO countries. Anti-tank missiles, drones, and air defense systems altered battlefield dynamics. Information sharing, satellite imagery, and logistical support helped Ukrainian forces conduct precise operations against Russian advances. The strategic outcome was clear. Alliances and partnerships, even informal ones, can shift the balance of power without deploying armies directly. Energy politics became central. Europe, historically dependent on Russian gas, accelerated renewable energy adoption, LNG imports, and infrastructure investments. Russia, in turn, leveraged pipelines, energy contracts, and alternative markets to maintain revenue streams. The energy dimension highlighted a critical lesson. In the modern era, control over resources is both an economic and a geopolitical weapon. Soft power campaigns also shaped global perceptions. Media narratives, cultural influence, and information operations were deployed on multiple fronts. Russia sought to justify its actions domestically and internationally, while Ukraine leveraged social media, global press coverage, and diaspora networks to garner sympathy, aid, and political support. The battle for hearts and minds became as consequential as artillery strikes or missile barrages, demonstrating the blurred lines between perception and reality in modern geopolitics. Technology emerged as a new arena of competition. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and electronic warfare complemented conventional operations. Both Russia and Ukraine utilized advanced systems to gather intelligence, disrupt opponents, and communicate strategy. Meanwhile, Western allies provided technological support, creating a multi-layered digital battlefield that reflected the evolving nature of modern conflicts. The global implications were profound. NATO strengthened, the European Union acted as a security actor, and countries worldwide reconsidered neutrality, alliances, and economic dependencies. Emerging powers watched carefully, evaluating whether to align with the West, maintain ties with Russia, or pursue independent strategies. The Ukraine conflict demonstrated that modern conflicts are rarely isolated. They influence diplomacy, trade, and security far beyond the battlefield. For ordinary citizens, the war is not distant. Energy prices, trade disruptions, media narratives, and the displacement of millions affect lives across continents. Education, careers, and daily choices are subtly shaped by geopolitical competition. Understanding the dynamics of alliances, economic leverage, and strategic calculations is essential for navigating a world where global conflicts intersect with everyday life. In conclusion, the Ukraine war reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Alliances evolved, strategies adapted, and the global balance of power was tested. Economic influence, military cooperation, and information campaigns emerged as critical tools of statecraft. The war revealed the complexity of modern international relations, demonstrating that geopolitics is a high-stakes game with consequences for nations, economies, and individuals alike. As Russia continues its campaign, the world watches closely. Future conflicts will likely reflect the lessons learned in Ukraine, the importance of alliances, the power of economic tools, the impact of technology, and the enduring significance of strategy in shaping global outcomes.
We've examined Russia's rise, the Ukraine invasion, military strategies, economic leverage, and global alliances. But all these grand strategies and geopolitical maneuvers have one undeniable reality. They affect people. Not governments, not generals. People. Ordinary citizens, families, students, workers, and small businesses are caught in the web of a conflict whose reach extends far beyond borders. Let's begin with daily life in Ukraine. Cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol have been transformed from centers of commerce, culture, and community into zones of uncertainty, danger, and disruption. Families live under constant threat of missile strikes and artillery fire. Shelters become homes, schools double as emergency centers, and routines are shattered. Children grow up surrounded by sirens, evacuation orders, and news reports that tell them the world is suddenly unpredictable. Jobs, education, and personal safety are no longer guaranteed. They are contingent on the next military move or ceasefire agreement. Beyond Ukraine, the conflict reshaped Europe and the broader world. Energy prices surged, inflation rose, and supply chains, once taken for granted, became fragile. Ordinary citizens felt the effects at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in utility bills. Even if someone lived thousands of kilometers away from the front line, the ripples of war were unavoidable. The war demonstrated that in a globalized world, no country is truly isolated from international crises. Technology plays a paradoxical role. On one hand, it allows people to stay connected, access critical information, and coordinate support. Apps for donations, volunteering, or tracking refugees became lifelines. On the other, the same technology exposes civilians to cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, and digital surveillance. Algorithms can amplify fear, filter information, or shape perceptions in subtle ways. Social media becomes a battleground where truth competes with propaganda, and ordinary users must navigate an increasingly complex digital reality. The economic impact is equally profound. Many companies worldwide face supply chain disruptions, impacting employment and wages. Industries tied to energy, logistics, technology, or trade had to adjust rapidly. For example, factories dependent on Ukrainian or Russian exports faced delays or shutdowns. Workers suddenly confronted uncertainty, not because of local decisions, but because of geopolitics halfway across the continent. Migration and displacement tell another human story. Millions fled Ukraine, seeking safety in Poland, Germany, Romania, and beyond. Refugees navigate new languages, cultures, and systems while coping with trauma. Host countries face the challenge of integration, housing, and services. The war's human cost is measured not only in statistics, but in the stories of families uprooted, careers interrupted, and communities reshaped overnight. Education and careers are also affected. Scholarships, internships, and international programs are delayed or canceled. Students in Ukraine or in countries economically linked to Russia face uncertainty in academic planning. Parents and young professionals confront difficult choices, whether to relocate, change careers, or adapt to rapidly shifting markets. Career trajectories that once seemed predictable are now linked to global strategies, sanctions, and international partnerships. Even culture and media are impacted. Films, books, and music become mediums for storytelling, resistance, or influence. Memes, viral videos, and social campaigns illustrate the war's reality, inspire solidarity, and sometimes manipulate perception. Cultural output is now both a form of expression and a tool of soft power. Ordinary people, by watching, sharing, or participating, contribute to the broader narrative of conflict. The psychological effects are far-reaching. Constant exposure to news about military strikes, sanctions, or refugee crises can create anxiety, stress, and a sense of helplessness. Yet amidst adversity, communities demonstrate resilience. Volunteers, local organizations, and international NGOs work tirelessly to provide support. Ordinary acts of kindness, sharing resources, mentoring displaced students, or helping neighbors become crucial to sustaining daily life.
Looking forward, the human impact of the Ukraine war is a lesson in resilience, adaptation, and interconnectedness. The new global conflict doesn't exist in isolation. It intersects with technology, economics, education, and culture. Understanding this is critical, not only for policymakers, but for everyday citizens who live in its shadow. Innovation and adaptation have emerged as key survival mechanisms. In Ukraine, temporary classrooms, telemedicine, and digital banking solutions allowed life to continue despite displacement. Businesses shifted to remote work, supply chains adapted with new logistics routes, and communities created networks of mutual support. Globally, companies and governments recognize the importance of resilience planning, redundancy, and flexibility. Ordinary citizens, by learning new skills or adopting new tools, became participants in this adaptive ecosystem. Technology as empowerment also highlights opportunity amidst crisis. Cybersecurity awareness, digital literacy, and access to real-time information became critical for safety, business, and education. Individuals who understood digital tools could navigate uncertainty more effectively, access humanitarian aid, and participate in remote work or learning. Technology bridges the gap between global events and personal agency, enabling people to respond proactively to challenges. Education for a new era has shifted focus. Curricula increasingly emphasize global awareness, critical thinking, STEM skills, and resilience training. Students learn not just history or math, but how conflicts, sanctions, and global alliances influence their future opportunities. Young people develop skills in diplomacy, economics, and technology, not as abstract concepts, but as tools for navigating a world shaped by ongoing crises. Global cooperation and shared responsibility are critical takeaways. Even as nations compete, collaboration on humanitarian aid, refugee support, and post-conflict reconstruction becomes essential. Ordinary citizens participate by donating, volunteering, and advocating for policies that reduce human suffering. The Ukraine war demonstrates that in a globalized world, individuals are stakeholders in international stability, not just observers. Economic adaptation continues to shape human life. Consumers, investors, and workers adjust to new realities, finding alternatives in energy, technology, and trade. Job opportunities shift to sectors resilient to disruption, and companies innovate to survive sanctions or supply chain challenges. Every purchase, investment, or career choice reflects a response to a complex web of global interdependence. The cultural dimension cannot be understated. Art, literature, music, and social media all reflect and shape public perception. People use these platforms to document lives, advocate for justice, and preserve heritage amidst conflict. Cultural engagement becomes a form of agency, demonstrating that even amidst global upheaval, ordinary people can influence narratives, inspire solidarity, and maintain identity. Finally, the war teaches a profound lesson about individual responsibility in a divided world. Awareness, critical thinking, adaptability, and engagement are not abstract virtues, they are survival skills. Whether by participating in community support, staying informed, or learning new digital competencies, individuals shape the human response to geopolitical crises. For young people especially, the message is clear. The new global conflict is not just about leaders, borders, or armies. It is about how every choice, what you study, where you work, how you consume information, and how you participate in society, intersects with global events. The future depends on engagement, innovation, and the ability to connect individual action with broader global dynamics. In conclusion, the Ukraine war and Russia's broader ambitions remind us that the stakes of global conflict are deeply human. Every displaced family, every disrupted career, every fluctuating commodity price is a reflection of strategic decisions made thousands of kilometers away. Yet the story is not only one of hardship, it is also one of resilience, adaptation, and agency. The new global conflict may be complex, but it is not beyond human influence. Technology, education, culture, and civic engagement offer tools for navigating a divided world. Ordinary people, by understanding their interconnected role, can turn uncertainty into opportunity, adversity into innovation, and vulnerability into empowerment. The final takeaway? The new global conflict is not just a story of nations, it is a story of people. And every individual, in daily choices, actions, and awareness, is part of that story. The world may be divided by strategy, power, and ambition, but it is united by human resilience, creativity, and the shared pursuit of stability, progress, and life amidst uncertainty.
The story of Russia's new empire and the Ukraine invasion isn't just headlines. It affects all of us. Stay informed, question what you see, and think critically. Talk about it, share ideas, learn more. Act. Support, help, engage. Every choice matters. The world is moving fast, and the next chapter is being written now. Don't just watch, be part of it. Your knowledge, your voice, your action shape the future.